This is Chapter 7 of the International Relations class. We'll be talking about international governmental organizations. Now, keep in mind that whenever I'm talking about international governmental organizations, I'm referring to IOs. So international organizations are going to be synonymous with international governmental organizations. Now, Chapter 7, I want to break that up into a couple of different lectures. This one we'll be talking about international organizations, and then the next lecture we'll be talking about international law, and then we'll be talking a little bit more about perhaps human rights and international criminal court. Now, backing up a little bit, at the end of World War II, the United Nations was formed, had originally 51 member states. The modern era of international relations, you could say, was formed in the aftermath of World War II so that we would try to prevent this from happening again. We want to increase international order, prevent another world war, and then with the decolonialism process after World War II, membership doubles in the United Nations, and that's pretty much part of being recognized as a state, that you are a member of the United Nations. Now, also in the aftermath of World War II, the Bretton Woods Conference, where particularly the United States and UK representatives got together to create the modern international organizations, particularly with regulating our global economy, that are still in existence to today. And we'll talk about these typical organizations later on in our economic section, particularly the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or the World Trade Organization. We'll get into those later. Today we're going to talk more in detail about the United Nations as probably the most prominent international organization in the world. Now we have to back up a little bit and review our theories of international relations with the institutionalist perspective and the realist perspective. Now, as you can imagine, the international organizations could be explained quite logically through the institutionalist view of international relations. And this is where these IOs are created by the states to serve their needs. And so these IOs facilitate norms of cooperation and compromise. So these are part of the institutionalist principles. Political action is somewhat easier through consensus, quotes, because it's not really easy, but perhaps better than competition, disagreement, and conflict. States usually do follow rules and keep commitments in order to maintain their credibility and their respect as sovereign entities. So that's part of what fits into the institutionalist view. And so these norms of cooperation, compromise, consensus, those are institutionalized and start to gain legitimacy on the global scale. And that's why IOs are created and maintain their existence over time. Now, when you look at the realist perspective as to why IOs exist, here is a subtle distinction created by the states to serve their needs. Now look at the difference here. Institutionalist view created by the states to serve their needs, whereas here created by the states to serve their needs. So that is a subtle but important distinction, but the realist view is where the states are self-interested into maintaining their power and self-interests. That falls right in line with the realist view, and that's why the IOs would be created. And when we see that when costs are less than benefits, then it's practical for states to delegate things to international organizations. And we've touched on a few of these already, particularly things such as environmental issues, human rights issues, even some peacekeeping operation issues, those sort of things that we'll talk about. Now, with the realist view, sovereignty, of course, remains the reigning norm. So states are still pursuing their own competitive self-interests and, perhaps trying to maximize their power in some way. But also from the realist perspective, the IOs are not only created by the states, but they're dominated by the powerful states. And yes, as we see with all of these theories, there is a little bit of overlap between these views. Yes, states do literally delegate things to the IOs, and the IOs create their own players in the game. But then again, the powerful states, as we'll see, particularly the permanent members of the Security Council, will have more of a say over what the IOs can accomplish. As far as the basic roles of international organizations, they serve as an interactive forum. The UN General Assembly, a very prominent example of that, where the states can all come together and use diplomacy to try to figure out what problems there are globally and how to resolve them. So this is a preferable alternative to fighting each other on the battlefield. And as we see, these resolutions are these conventions that are created through the General Assembly. These have very prominently over the years led to most of our major treaties out there in the world, that the UN General Assembly would come together, and it might take years to do this. That's why they would create a convention that would focus on that particular issue, and over time create a treaty. So interactive forums, very major part of IOs. And then they can potentially become an independent international actor. One of the examples is the World Health Organization, where once they're created, they develop their own system. They become bureaucratic in their own way, and they become something of a provider of global public goods and become an independent actor out there in the world. So there's the WTO is another prime example of that has considerable power in trying to referee the trade between countries. So what we see is that they become supranational legal entities in this way, where the states would agree to give way to the international rules of the WTO, for example, or the International Court of Justice, for example. Now, we're going to be talking about international law in the next lecture, and we'll see how difficult international law is to evolve and coalesce in a world of sovereign states. But because one of the biggest obstacles is that states actually have to agree to give their jurisdiction to that international court. And what we see is most states are not, particularly the powerful states like the United States, are not very willing to do that. The IOs have grown dramatically over the past few decades, and we still have the major prominent ones, but what we see is that the states, can achieve goals through IOs that they can't achieve alone. So that, particularly with some of these issues that we talked about with environmental issues or human rights issues, by getting the IOs involved in that, states can achieve those goals. United Nations, for example, has set goals to alleviate poverty around the world and has made significant strides in reaching those goals. We see that with the modern world of international communication and contact and interdependence, we see that IOs are becoming a little bit more logical to be major players in the world because of the increasing amount of problems that are global in nature. And we see that lots of states are unable to provide their own security for their own people. So the pooling of resources in IOs can help that. And the small states in particular can get strength through this concept of collective action through things like the General Assembly, to where they can all have an equal voice. And there have been some major successes. One of the reasons why international organizations still exist is because they do provide a service that states want and need, and they are successful at that enough to where they still exist. Now, obviously, they've had some failures, and if powerful states want to predominate, then the IO will most likely take a back seat and not be as effective. So that's kind of how it works out there in the real world. So let's talk a little bit about the United Nations in particular, one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent international organization in the world. It's a symbol of international order. Once it was created after World War II, this was provided something that was very important that everybody would want to be a member of, to be recognized as a state. And the General Assembly, each state has an equally one vote there to come to agreements on the floor for resolutions and to creating of conventions and that sort of thing. They also are composed of various membership councils that are tackling different issues, whether it's poverty or health, things like that, that are a little bit more efficient to tackle. We'll look at the org chart here in a minute. The Security Council is the part of the United Nations that decides on these peacekeeping issues. There's 15, at any given time, there's 15 countries that are sitting on the Security Council, but as we'll talk about here in a few minutes, 5 of those are permanent members, and that gives them a disproportionate amount of power, particularly when they have the power to veto any type of proposal as well. So we're looking at economic and social councils that are more efficiently tackling certain problems. We've got the International Court of Justice, which was part of the UN Charter, but acts very independently as a international court. Now here's the org chart. As you can see, the General Assembly is literally overseeing all of these programs and funds. Here, some of these you may be familiar with, such as UN Development Program, UN Environmental Program. There's UNICEF. We actually, when I was a child, on the night before Halloween, we would go trick-or-treating for UNICEF and collect coins. So these are mostly funded by volunteer donations. And then there's the Security Council that comes here and has various bodies that it is responsible for, most prominently the peacekeeping operations right there, which has a budget that is about as large as the rest of the UN budget combined as well, because the peacekeeping operations take quite a bit more resources and manpower to maintain those. There's the economic and social councils there, some of which are spread out in this group right here, and then quite a few councils here that you may be somewhat familiar with as far as economic commissions of various regions in the world. Now these over here are the specialized agencies that are affiliated, but not, they basically work independently or autonomously, as you can see down here, such as the IMF and the WHO that we've already talked about, the World Bank. Though they are organizations that are working with, affiliated with these agencies through various programs, but are basically autonomous. The Secretariat is what we would call the administrative arm of the United Nations, and of course the International Court of Justice is the court that states can bring cases against each other. We'll talk about that in more detail in the next lecture. Now the UN has a Secretary General, and the Security Council nominates one or more candidates, and then they have to be selected. And what we also see is that the permanent 5 members have a potential to veto that. Antonio Guterres was appointed in 2016 for a 5-year term, heads the Secretariat staff of about 15,000, about half of which are in the UN building in New York City. Now, this does not include the staffs of all the other economic councils. This is just purely the administrative staff here. There's a lot of political maneuvering goes on to select that leadership, because the permanent 5, which we'll talk about here in a minute, which includes the United States, Britain, France, and Russia and China, they can veto candidates that they feel that might not be in their own interest, and this is all done behind closed doors. So what we see is that the leader of the UN, the Secretary General, is fairly non-controversial. They are largely restrained and administrative. They're not necessarily a major player out on the world stage, but we do see that once they become the leader and they're in charge of this organization that is connected throughout the world, then they start to express their autonomousness and their independence, because the UN then becomes a separate player, even though it's created by the states. Once it's created, it becomes its own separate player out there in the international system, which is interesting how that comes about. Now, we also got examples of this independence when Ban Ki-moon was the Secretary General in the run-up to the Iraq War. President George Bush wanted to get the UN involved in that, and we'll talk about that more here in a minute, but Ban Ki-moon did not want to express his desire to attach on to the invasion of Iraq, and so therefore the United States did not get UN sponsorship or UN approval of the Iraq War back in 2003. So that was a case of the UN leadership expressing some independence there, as we saw in that particular case. Speaking of the UN Security Council, we got 15 members that are on it at any given time, and the 5 permanent members, US, Russia, UK, France, and China, they will always be there per the charter, and they have veto power, as we'll see in a minute. That is part of what is the biggest complaint about the UN, particularly with the security issues, is that these 5 states here can pretty much prevent something from happening. If any one of those states vetoes something, it's not going to happen. The 10 non-permanent members serve for 2-year terms, and these are the current members right now, and these members rotate on regional sectors. For example, Africa will have 2 states on it at any given time. South America will have about 2 states on it at any given time. Europe, at least 2 states. Asia, perhaps 2 states. Something like that. Over the 5 different regions of the world, they will rotate those 2 members in and out so that they do provide some geographic spread there. But the 5 permanent members will always be in place, more than likely. Speaking of which, the lack of democracy, some of the major issues with the UN Security Council, particularly issues with states that could use the most benefit with the UN Security Council, the poorer states, the less powerful states. Clearly, there's a lack of democracy when you've got 5 states that can really determine yes or no what's going to happen out there. And we also see that because of those 5 permanent states, that represents a geographic or a demographic imbalance that kind of remains throughout. When you look at some of these poor states that have big populations, that they are potentially shut out at times, or that they're not going to have say that's going to overcome the P5. Another interesting thing about this is that two of the most powerful and economically stable countries in the world are Germany and Japan, and they are not going to be permanent members. And so as you can see, the permanent five there are the winners of World War II. So that's kind of how it works. The winners kind of shape it and call the shots for the subsequent aftermath. So Germany and Japan, very, very powerful, stable economic states there, shut out of the permanent five. So this results in somewhat of an inaccurate reflection of current power realities. One of the questions is, should we give more veto power to a couple other states, such as Germany and Japan, or should we eliminate the veto power altogether? Those are valid questions that might result in some changes as far as the involvement of the UN Security Council and their peacekeeping troops. However, either one of these is going to be difficult because, according to the Charter, an amendment would require 2/3 of the General Assembly. Now, that may not be that difficult to gather, but it would require all of the permanent five members to agree on that amendment. So all five permanent members would have to agree to either eliminate the veto power or to give that veto power to a couple more states. And we know that if the veto power is given to a few more states, well, then that would just make it even more complicated, because then you would have a couple of more states that could potentially prevent something from happening. If, for example, if Japan doesn't get along with China, then they would perhaps be on opposite pages much of the time, just like the United States and Russia are on opposite pages much of the time. And so that brings up the point of rivalries. I already talked about the potential rivalry between China and Japan. China would be reluctant to admit Japan as a permanent member, or maybe even India, which is a huge population. And then admitting India would also perhaps rankle Pakistan. So we got rivalries going on there. Historically, we've seen some other interesting issues. Back in 1971, the People's Republic of China, or the mainland China, replaced the island of Taiwan. Before that, it was called Formosa. And so the United States kind of had to shift gears there, recognizing mainland China as the state of China that was recognized also in the UN Security Council. We also have seen some other issues that the UN Security Council was trying for several years to try to resolve the issue in Sudan, which had a civil war going on for quite a bit of time there, and could not really seem to, despite the resolutions, and a peacekeeping troop there, could not really seem to mediate a peace process. And then it was actually a local group, or I guess you could say an African trade group, in this case the Intergovernmental Authority on Development there in Africa, and was spearheading the peace process, and it was mediated by the African Union, and that eventually led to Sudan breaking apart into Sudan and South Sudan. So that shows how perhaps local or regional authorities might have a little bit more effective involvement than the UN, perhaps, but those are some issues there. And we also see that initially Russia and China had vetoed a U.S.-backed resolution that was going to sanction the Syrian president for using banned chemical weapons, in this case chlorine. So we've got some differences there between the five permanent members on the Security Council. The United States itself has had ongoing tensions with the UN for quite a while. The United States, being the most powerful state in the world, is often reluctant to share power, or to most certainly to give up power to the UN. And if it's in the U.S.'s interest, they will typically lead that and then try to recruit the UN to come along. As with the war on terror, as with the war in Iraq, the U.S. acted very unilaterally on that when the UN was not willing to endorse it or to come on board. And then when there is a UN coalition and the United States is involved in that, they are typically, their power is amplified as generally the leader of this coalition, which is also fairly logical that that would occur because the United States contributes the most to the UN and has, of course, by far the largest military force. So it would also be somewhat rational to be the leader of that coalition as well. But we also see that the U.S. is in the minority on many issues that concern poor states because we're not poor. So most of the countries in the world are poor, and so therefore the General Assembly is sometimes used as a forum for the poor states to try to come together to create resolutions that not only would help them, but might actually criticize the richer states of the world. And the United States has had a couple of situations where we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail later on, particularly with respect to the International Court of Justice, but particularly in the aftermath of 9/11, the United States wanted to act unilaterally as the leader in the war on terror and did not want to be handcuffed or hindered or resisted in any way by international organizations, and so had kind of pushed beyond the UN and even withheld dues in some cases because of differences with the UN. And I've already talked about how in the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War, the United States did take it to the UN because they did want to get a UN resolution as well. But very early on, Russia and France both said that they would veto an Iraq war resolution by the UN. So that failed as far as getting the UN backing on that. Now, looking at the UN peacekeeping forces, this was not initially in the Charter of the United Nations. The initial idea was that all the countries that were members of the UN Security Council would pool their forces and go attack this problem out there in the world. And you could imagine how effective that force would be if you're looking at combining China's and Russia's and England's and United States military forces to go take care of a problem somewhere in the world. They would probably be able to take care of it pretty quickly. But when you look at the differences, particularly the immediate differences that fell between the United States and the Soviet Union and the United States and Russia, or excuse me, the United States and China, that did not pan out at all. So what we do then is create the peacekeeping forces that are designed to play a neutral role and sent to regions that are fairly agreed upon. Well, they have to be agreed upon by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So if there's any of those 5 members that have personal security interests, they may not authorize peacekeeping forces, and they may prefer, such as the United States, may prefer to take care of that with their own militaries. So that's why we have these differences. But any peacekeeping force has to be granted by the Security Council, and the funds are voted on by the General Assembly, and those special assessments are accrued with the member states. And we do see that the United States pays for about 28% of the UN peacekeeping forces. And the UN, therefore, when they send these peacekeeping forces, the blue helmets they're called, they are there to act as a buffer to hopefully keep a threshold of violence from flaring up and going into full-scale war. They have not always been successful, but they have had peacekeeping missions where they have, their presence alone has served to prevent major wars from breaking out. And since 1945, the UN has sent over 9 million soldiers to 61 different missions, 2,800 have died. And we see the troops typically come from the least developed countries. These states right here account for more than 1/3 of the total of about 90,000 peacekeeping forces around the world, and only 30 personnel come from the United States. And clearly, there's lots of budget restraints here because the money has to be raised through member states, and they cannot raise a fraction of the money that a member state can raise as far as its own military goes. Also have to deal with the veto power of the Security Council. And the United States, as we'll talk about this in more detail later on, the United States does not want to be under the jurisdiction of an international court. So the United States kind of goes out of its way to declare its troops to be exempt from any type of international jurisdiction, whether it's the International Court of Justice or even more importantly, the International Criminal Court, which we'll talk about in another lecture. The list of the peacekeeping mission locations currently going on out there in the world. We see that we've got peacekeeping operations in Mali, Western Sahara, Darfur, Kosovo, Cyprus, Lebanon, India, and Pakistan. So we can see most of them there, Africa, Middle East. And we see that some of these have been around for quite a long time. Some of these missions have been, for example, this Disengagement Observer Force established in 1974. Here's one in Lebanon, established in 78. The Basic Truce Supervision Organization as far back as 1948. So some of these operations have been around for quite a while. Some of the more recently established ones in Mali, 2013, Central African Republic in 2014. Give you some examples there. And what we see is that it's some free riding going on because the poor states are perhaps not able politically or financially to support peacekeeping troops. Because of this veto power, we see that the Security Council, their self-interest, have to come to some sort of agreement before peacekeeping troops are sent. And we see that initially in the Balkan War there, only 7,000 troops were initially sent. That was not enough to stop a 3-year war. And it was actually not until some UN peacekeeping troops were taken hostage that the international community did not get more involved and then played a peacekeeping role and then a mediator role to end that war, that Bosnian War in the Balkans. And this is the big question here. When do you send peacekeeping troops? The timing, of course, is very important when these peacekeeping troops are sent. We talked about Rwanda briefly in an earlier class, and they were sent but not effective enough or early enough perhaps to prevent the violence from flaring up, and then horrible situation where 800,000 people were literally murdered in about 3 months, and the peacekeeping troops helpless to do anything about it. Looking at the annual budget, around $5 billion for the typical UN budget, and this is not much compared to what states typically spend on their military. For example, the U.S. citizen, on average, as far as taxes go, pays about $2,000 a year on military, but it comes out to about $15 a year on UN dues and contributions. The peacekeeping budget, about $6.5 billion. To just give you comparison, the New York City Police and Fire Department's budget is at about $7.6 billion. So the entire peacekeeping budget is even less than that. So that shows you the challenges that they have as far as the constraints and where they can afford to send peacekeeping troops to. Also, when we look at the UN budget, the assessments are based on a formula. The United States pays about 22% of the basic general UN budget. And as I said before, Japan and Germany, which are literally shut out of the Permanent Security Council, are the second and third biggest contributors to the UN. Those the other contributors there, 6 countries at about 2% or more, and so the power rules in effect here. These 12 pay approximately 75% of the entire budget, but have about 5% of the voting power of the General Assembly. And 25% of the states shoot for about 0.001% of the budget. So that shows you how in an international system comprised of rich and poor states, which we'll talk about more later on, there is quite a bit of disparity in the financing of these international organizations. The next lecture, we'll talk specifically about international law. So stay tuned for discussion question on this section.